Hi, everybody. Lynn Cox here, clinical hypnotherapist. Recording this on Easter weekend. So happy Easter weekend to all. I'm going to launch right into it and talk about how sometimes challenging holidays can be for people who have come out of abusive domestic abuse relationships or have had um, childhood abuse experiences in their lives. So, first of all, I'm going to start off by saying loneliness and isolation is not reserved necessarily to people who have had um, broken families, broken relationships, experienced trauma and abuse. That actually is a little bit of an epidemic. So that aside, I just want to acknowledge that loneliness, isolation, that's something that's more and more of a common experience in our culture, generally speaking. But I want to talk today about how challenging holidays can be for people specifically who have had to escape a domestic violence situation and had their family dynamic um, really fractured by the experience of being abused in multiple ways as a child. So holiday seasons like this are oftentimes where we get together with our families to celebrate, to have dinners together, to have celebrations together. And when these times come around, it can be extremely painful because it does bring up right into your face, right into people's faces that that's something that's lacking in life, and it can be extraordinarily painful. I mean, going through domestic violence is extraordinarily painful. um, Having experienced abuse as a child, that's extraordinarily painful as well. And depending on where you're at in a cycle of healing and addressing these issues, it can be particularly challenging. So, what do I have to say about that and how people can maybe address that? Number one of the most important things in terms of any kind of acknowledgement, healing, recovery type of work is just that it's an actual acknowledgement of the pain of the situation, the disappointment of the situation, a mourning of what was lost. So, for example, in the case of, let's say, a woman who has left a violent partner, could be husband, could be father to children, a real acknowledgement of the sadness of the idea of the loss of that potential. So acknowledging it. Or if it's the case of, let's say, an individual who experienced abuse as a child from one of their family members and who has gone through the process of acknowledging it and perhaps severing communication with those members of the family who committed that abuse on them, and any other family members who were maybe complicit in that action. Again, it's an acknowledgement of the pain and the sadness of that loss. It's interesting, I will go back to this. So I used to work in a communications capacity at a local family shelter, and by and mostly who came to access those shelter services were women with children. So the way that family was defined was by anybody with children in their care, and it was more often than not women with children, typically not an entire nuclear family, and typically because the woman was trying to get away from an abusive situation. And so, back in those days, I was in a communications and PR role for the organization. So I wasn't working with the clients of the organization from a therapeutic standpoint, but I did work with you know, with the people within the organization who were treating those people, offering those more kind of counseling services. And it was interesting because there was a huge effort on the part of the organization to try to keep families together where possible. Like, so let's say a mother would come to the shelter, but she may have had some other issues, maybe some addiction issues, maybe some other mental health issues, where it would be questionable if she was fit enough to care for the child in the way we would imagine a healthy, um, totally emotionally and psychologically sound individual could. But there's a lot of research about how it's almost worse for kids to be pulled out of situations, even when maybe the care they're getting from the caregiver isn't, could verge on abuse and neglect. So what this organization did is they when I was there, opened up a more long-term residential situation where mothers could stay with their children, and there were also staff in the home to kind of put some care and checks and balances in, because it is very, very difficult for children to lose their family, even when that treatment is not great and verging on abuse. So how this all relates back to holiday seasons and a deep feeling of sadness and loss and missing out that a lot of people experience, is the fact that there is something innately in us that craves the familial unit. We are social creatures, regardless of if we've been treated horrifically by people. You hear this often with women who leave very violent, frightening situations. That feeling of sadness, of the still, love for the person, and the ever hope that something could change so that they could be, united in this different way. It really, I think, is just a human function of wanting connection and close connection and familial connection. So, acknowledging that there's a pain and a loss is really important, because when we don't address our emotions and pains, if we don't really look at them honestly and acknowledge them honestly, the way that we'll start to react and respond will come out in all sorts of different ways. So, one of my teachers, Marissa Peer, and I think that she took this phrase from another psychologist. Um, it's to the effect of the the feelings that can't be felt in tears will cause other organs to weep, and that's referring to all sorts of other, kind of coping mechanisms, as well as really strange things like kind of psychosomatic physical issues that can happen with people when they have unaddressed unaddressed trauma, unaddressed, very, very serious emotions, despair, deep, deep sadness. When those aren't seen and acknowledged, then they can start to cause all sorts of other problems. So an acknowledgement of it, write it down, do some journaling about it, really acknowledge it's fair. It's fair that even if you were abused as a child, or if you were, assaulted by a partner, and you know that is an experience that wasn't okay, and that you would never want to experience again or wish on anybody else, and would agree that no child should have those experiences, to acknowledge that there can still be a deep sadness at the loss of a family unit, a family relationship. Another thing that a lot of people who have experienced childhood abuse, where they've disclosed to the family, to whoever the perpetrators were, whoever was maybe in the parental situation, or the role that maybe should have been the protective role, if they were complicit at all, um, they often struggle with who from the family can they maintain relationships with. How does that look? What's that dynamic? Are they able to set it up with a family where they can maintain some relationships with people who weren't the direct abusers, and still and put up boundaries in place, i.e., never having to face the person who did these horrible things to them within the context of the family. It can become very challenging, very complicated, can make things like weekend holiday time, more difficult. And unfortunately, that is something that is difficult for people to navigate, and rightly so. And there's no really great solution to it. Some people decide to completely cut off their families, but then feel a loss at that. Some people decide to continue seeing everybody from that family unit, and then struggle in a different way around that. Others try to do this, where they set up some boundaries around the abuse was disclosed, their relationships with certain family members, not others, and there's parameters put up with respect to the amount of information that's shared, etc. And from what I've seen, those people tend to, even though that's still a very challenging situation, challenging to navigate, those people tend to feel a little bit better in a way because they have taken a more active role. They've set up some boundaries. They've also acknowledged um, the need and the want to maintain some familiar relationships if if the abuse can be acknowledged, and these kind of parameters and concessions can be set up. So, just wanted to say that today and this weekend, given it's a holiday weekend, and a lot of people do struggle around holidays who have had to leave a violent partner for their own safety and children's safety often, or have had their families fractured because of abuse committed on them as a child. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel a loss. People address these situations in many different ways. Um, and loneliness and isolation is something that is unfortunately more and more common. And looking at other ways to create community connections, form deep relationships. Some people go into faith communities. Some people build these relationships through shared love and interests of different hobbies, maybe a yoga community or another type of fitness community, or writing groups, or there a variety of different ways where you can develop close relationships based on some shared interests and passions. That can really help people out too. And just to remember that we are social creatures. We do need family and we do need friends. And that's something that when we feel is missing can be very challenging. And having a holiday season event come up really puts that front and center. Don't try to run away and hide from it, because what we try to run away from will just persist. It's like me saying, don't think of a pink elephant. That's the first thing that comes to mind. So that's the first step, is just to acknowledge and look at it and address it. And then to try to decide a path that works for you. Um, that's all I have to say about that. I hope everybody is well, and I will be on later. And happy Easter.